Well, this is the final product of the 4M41 conversion. Here I had the airbox. I've actually rotated the lid 90 degrees to the base, which has made it fit better in the Pajero. It's just the back corner of it's rubbing on the bonnet, so I'll need to adjust that a little bit. Front mount intercoolers in, using 2.5 inch aluminium plumbing, runs from the turbo through into the front. Comes around through the wheel well, up into the engine bay, and then up through to the throttle body. So intercooler is off a XR6 Turbo Falcon. It's off the F6 model, so it's the bigger version. I had to modify the outlet pipe, so I cut the pipe off the bottom there and welded it on the side there. So I had to weld a bracket on the top, but then the bottom two brackets I've used the factory Falcon brackets with some adapter plates. That one's probably a bit hard to see because it's up behind. To mount the ECU, I've chopped up the original Triton ECU mounting bracket. Just cut a piece off the bottom, and then I chopped up the Pajero mounting bracket. This is for the glow plug computer, which we no longer need. Now we've put the 4M41 in, and I just welded the two together, and then that just bolts back into the kick panel. The ECU's mounted up in the kick panel. So there was a couple of connectors. There's this C35 connector out of the Triton, and there's a couple of connectors right up behind the blower there. They're blue coloured. Basically it's those two connectors that everything connects into, and I'll go through that in a minute. And then up here I've mounted a couple of fuses behind the glove box. That's to power the immobiliser and to power the ECU. Up here is the immobiliser unit. And with all the carpet and kick panel put back in place, you wouldn't know it's not stock. So in my previous video I mentioned that you just needed the antenna off the end of the key barrel and the key. As it turns out, the thing doesn't like to work unless it's actually mounted to the key barrel. I believe it's pretty fussy in the position of the key, and it must also use some of the metal as part of the system. So I'm yet to experiment and see if I can make something a bit more compact to mount the key and the ring together. So for the moment I just keep this in the glove box. Also allows, if I'm going to park the car somewhere, I can pull the key out and immobilise it. For the wiring, I made up this spreadsheet to show the connections between the connectors. So the main connections are to the two blue connectors that are up behind the blower fan in the Pajero, which connect to the plugs that were inside the Triton next to the ECU. So you've got the immobiliser. You basically use the wiring out of the Triton, stripped out of the main loom, plus power and earth and ground. It also connects to the C34 connector. So these names are taken from the factory circuit diagrams. You then have the C35 connector, which has the tacho output from the ECU. I still need to make an adapter that converts the 2 pulses per revolution to 18 pulses per revolution to connect to the Pajero tacho. Don't worry about the automatic transmission stuff. Coolant temp, water level in the fuel filter, both connect directly to the Pajero connector. You've got CAN going over to the diagnostic port. With that, I just removed the Pajero one and tucked it up behind and pulled the D-pin, the power and ground wires out of it, and put them into the Triton one and plugged it back into place. They're exactly the same connector, so it fits in place. You've got the 12 volt ignition switch to the ECU. That comes from the Pajero connector. That's actually the feed to the glow plug ECU, amongst other things, so it's direct from the ignition switch. You just had to go via a fuse, which is up behind the glove box. The vehicle speed sensor, there's a read switch in the combi meter of the Pajero, and I just connected it straight to the ECU via the C35 pin connector. it's actually accurate. I put a scan tool on and it reads the same as my dash, which was really good. Check engine light. I ended up running a wire up behind the dash and reused. There's a spare space in the dash which just gives an orange square in the corner of the dash, and the glow plug light, which is just straight to your glow plug light. In the engine bay, there's a couple of wires. There's the A15 connector in the Triton. I basically cut the wires off that and connected them into the Pajero A16 connector. That's for the AC condenser fan relay. You then have power to the main control ECU. What I did there is use the intercooler fan power feed. So basically I pulled the relay out and put some jumpers across where the main contacts are, which then makes the intercooler fan fuse become the main engine fuse. It's the right size and everything, which is good. I then also cut and spliced into the starter signal, which you can find in the Pajero connector under the dash. Steering pressure, I actually broke the tab off my pressure sensor, so I haven't actually hooked it up, but plan to run a separate wire down to the ECU. The next two connectors you don't need. The other engine bay connector, there's just the one that needs to be connected on that. That connector's under the fuse box in the Triton. So you have the AC pressure dual pressure input switch, which controls the AC compressor relay. So I just tapped into that wire, so you can see here on this circuit diagram for the Pajero. See here, we just tapped into this connection here, which is the wire between the dual pressure switch and the AC. Just tapped that off and connected it in. And now the air conditioning works as well. A couple of other things that needed connecting. Was the AC compressor, clutch relay. So I had to cut that wire off the relay in the engine bay and wired it into the A16 connector of the Pajero, which then drives the thing, the AC compressor. So that would be this wire down here, going down to the ECU. I also ran separate wires for the oil pressure gauge and oil pressure switch. So you take the oil pressure sender, if you have the gauge up in the center of your dash, you just take that sender and put it into the Triton engine and connect the wires up, run a wire under the dash and connect it to the connector, the Pajero connector. And I also added the oil pressure switch because I had the gauge, so I've run that new wire up to the dash and connected it into the oil pressure light, which is actually there, it's just not connected.